So, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Women's History Month event where we're highlighting women or organizers in the housing space. Um, if everybody could just write in the chat what experiences you've seen as a woman in the housing space or as an ally in the housing space, what have you seen happening? Would love to hear your anecdotes in the chat. So just put those in now if you can while we kick this off. So welcome. So I'm Leonora Kamner. I'm executive director of Abundant Housing LA. We're a pro-housing advocacy organization. Our mission is to address the upstream causes of the housing crisis and the housing shortage and build a movement for structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. Why is abundant housing so important? There are a few main reasons, such as more affordable housing, and environmental sustainability, but it's also crucial for addressing racial and economic inequality. You know, white exclusion really created the single family zoning situation, and then it sold it back to the public as the American dream. More housing density means more diversity and more neighbors. So how do we seek to achieve abundant housing? We do advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture to see housing as what it is, which is a good thing. So thanks everybody for being here and joining our event. Nobody's put any anecdotes in the chat, but I would love to hear some short stories, maybe a sentence or two about what you've seen as a woman or as an ally in the housing advocacy space. Anything that you might want to share with the group. Um, great. Thank you. So she just shared something in the chat. She works for a nonprofit affordable housing developer, and there isn't a lot of young women of color in leadership. Thank you for sharing that. That's really important to highlight. Okay. So Women's History Month, and please keep sharing the anecdotes in the chat as we keep going. So Women's History Month is this month. So we're going to use this time to reflect on the obstacles that we face as women and what we can do to address them. I think we should also use this time to reflect on the intersection with racial justice and how our work relates to a future where everyone can be treated equally and what that really means in practice. So this has been a really hard last year for women. The pandemic started about 1 year ago. Many women lost jobs. Many women have been struggling with childcare. I would love it if people could also share some things that you think women uniquely experience during this pandemic also as effects of the housing crisis. Like, how do all of these crises kind of intersect for women? I think housing was really crucial during the time of people who were, maybe didn't have enough who didn't have enough space, who were in overcrowding conditions. I think that's uniquely difficult for women with children, providing that childcare. Would love to hear other thoughts that people might have. Thanks, Chelsea, for sharing the anecdote about the moms who occupied the vacant housing in El Sereno. I think ACE was organizing with them on that, so that was a really good job that ACE did. So I'd love to share some info about me personally, about what it's been like being a woman in housing advocacy. I've had a lot of experiences with gendered language used against me, just general dismissiveness. I think that's the most common thing. I experienced a lot of situations where people want to put me in my place as a woman, especially a woman that appears maybe younger than I actually am. So people love to sort of talk down to me, put me in my place. Definitely experienced that a lot in this housing advocacy space. There's a video on YouTube where a NIMBY in my home city is saying I'm a child. So that you can see that on YouTube if you go to our channel. But the thing that gets me through this is other women and allies in this space. Thank you, Gabriella, for also mentioning increase in intimate partner violence. It's a really important aspect of this pandemic. Um, so I just want to express my appreciation for other women and feminine people. I think women supporting other women is just so important for us, uh, getting to a future where we can be treated with respect, where we have equality. So appreciate you all. Nancy and Chelsea, especially, you've just been really, really great to work with. I feel like, we've definitely been supporting each other through this housing advocacy. And yeah, so thank you so much for being here. And I'm just going to introduce the panelists now. So we have Nancy Barba. Nancy Barba is a Los Angeles native. She's committed to an equitable and inclusive sustainable future. She's an organizer with Culver City for More Homes, a grassroots group of Culver City residents and stakeholders devoted to making housing more plentiful, affordable, and equitable for everyone, while protecting renters and unwinding the city's historic legacy of redlining and restrictive zoning. And just shout out to Culver City for More Homes. Has been really successful, really excited about how that's taken off. During the day, her work focuses on supporting local policy actors, partnering with local governments, regional energy networks, utilities, and community choice aggregators, helping them achieve their climate action goals by putting energy efficiency into practice. She leads a team delivering energy efficiency program design, implementation, administration, and regulatory support. She works closely with counties, councils of government, and state financing agencies by overseeing and directing marketing, outreach, education, and training to homeowners, contractors, and dealers. So thank you so much, Nancy. And then I'm going to introduce Chelsea. Um, so Chelsea Byers is a community organizer and social impact strategist. As a West Side renter, Chelsea is dedicated to building people power in support of eradicating the root causes driving LA's homelessness and housing affordability crisis. She's a member of the West Hollywood Housing Element Task Force and a board member of Abundant Housing LA. So I'm gonna turn it over now to Chelsea to start us off, if that's okay with you. And yeah, take it away, Chelsea.
Thanks. It's really, really great to be here with you, Leonora and Nancy, and everyone who's joining the call. I'm going to just start by sharing a little bit of my background and sort of how I came to be a part of this housing movement. The more I think and reflect on my personal story, the more I really find the values that I'm guided by and better understand the direction I hope we can head as a movement. So just, we'll share a little bit about that. So I grew up in Mesa, Arizona, where my dad worked in his whole life in construction. He set custom installation tile flooring in new constructions and remodels all across the valley. And when I was young, I got to go to job sites with him. We, just wake up on Saturday mornings, pick up an Egg McMuffin and head on over to the job site. And I just got to see people's dream homes in construction. And it was awesome. It was really just such a special feeling getting to step into what somebody was going to call as their home and get to be a part of the construction in small ways, even if it was just splashing buckets of grout onto those new shiny floors. But it felt really special, and it really made me deeply value the concept of home. On top of that, my mom was a victim of violence and poverty in her life, and she really holds a tender heart for people who fall in hard times. And so she worked really hard to make sure that my family's home was a place of safety. In fact, she worked so hard at that it became a place of safety for so many other people throughout my life. We had friends who would fall in hard times, who would stay with us for days on end, runaways who would seek refuge in our home after fights in their families. We're a really open family, and just having housing stability for us meant that we could extend some feeling of safety or comfort or stability for others in our community. So I learned and witnessed really early how home was really essential to these things that felt essential, safety, comfort, stability, family, community. And I really grew up valuing and treasuring those things. Later, when I learned that my aunt had become homeless and impacted by a drug and alcohol addiction, I learned that sometimes there was a lot more that we had to do as a community to keep people safe and healthy. And that was a really a big awakening to me, that no matter how many people we could, have come into our own home, that sometimes there was more that we needed to do as a society to help people. Um, that became even more real when my family lost our home that I grew up in the 2008 financial crisis. My world turned completely upside down. I would come to find out later at my 10-year high school reunion just how many of my classmates were deeply impacted by that crisis. But at the time, it felt like I was totally alone, and that was just my fate. At the same time, I had taken out a massive student loan to go to college. And the idea of not coming home to the home I knew was very devastating and unsettling. And it really rocked me in a financial way as well. My family would become renters. We would lose the savings that they had invested into our home. And I myself would become, just riddled with massive amounts of student loan debt for who knows how long. It's still growing. And the economic realities of securing safe and stable housing for the long haul became an ongoing challenge for my life in that instance. So this is something I'm compelled to be a part of because of my own personal experience. But in coming to Los Angeles, I really began connecting with others around my history for the first time. I think it's something about living in a city that is so deeply unaffordable and so visibly screwed up and just so willfully leaving so many people out to die. I think we are just all so angry to the point of us screaming loud enough so we can all hear each other. And for me, that was a gift in many ways, to be able to reckon with my own past and find a community of people who were ready to do something about it and really connected because of that. This group of people wasn't willing to accept that fate, that we couldn't find place in LA, that we couldn't stay here, that it couldn't be for us. They were visionary and audacious people, and that knew that by linking our common struggles, we could really make a difference. And so that was really what brought me to my work in the housing movement here in Los Angeles. It's what got me connected to Leonora and Abundant Housing very early on. It's what led me to work for 3 years with the Everyone In campaign at United Way, where I was able to mobilize community members in support of supportive housing, a specific type of housing that is needed for our most impactful community members. Cute kitty stuff happening over here. And now I'm really fortunate to serve as a board member of Abundant Housing and on the Housing Element Task Force for the city of West Hollywood. But I just will say I've come to really think about my experience as a woman in housing a few different ways. Of course, it was pretty obvious to Leonora and myself very early on. I remember some conversations we had 2016, 17, just looking around the room and saying, we really need to get more women here. I think Leonora actually really was excited to have me be a part of it because she said, I just, need more women to be a part of this conversation. And it wasn't a reason that I had been brought into movement spaces before. I was working with survivors. I was working in education, places that were typically dominated by women. So I was like, what do you mean we need more women in this space? They must be somewhere. But I really appreciate Leonora, for a long time flagging that more women's voices needed to be centered in this conversation, because it's very true. And then I witnessed that firsthand in one of my first, very exciting experiences as an advocate here in Los Angeles, working on housing, when I was invited to speak on a panel at the Southern California Association of Governments conference, where all of our municipal city leaders gathered to make, learn and assert priorities for their cities. I didn't really think about gender in housing again in a real big way. I know I wasn't certainly talking about it on that panel. I was doing the thing of advocating for more dense and walkable cities. And then I was just confronted with this assumption by a city council member in a city I will not mention, who said that my entire viewpoint would change once I had kids and needed a van to haul them around in. I just had, having been literally interrupted while I was speaking on a panel by a member of the audience who saw his authority as a city council member as reason enough to interrupt the young panelist and tell me that I was going to have kids. I don't plan to, and that I'd be driving a van around a city someday. It was just pretty wild, and a really big moment of recognizing that, as is true of most spaces, we have to challenge patriarchy while we organize in this space on housing. So I have a lot more I want to say, but I want to sort of yield the floor and allow Nancy to jump in and introduce herself, and we'll keep talking. Is that the right way?
Great. Thank you, Chelsea, for that really amazing introduction. And so by way of introduction, and thank you, Leonora, for kind of sharing my bio I will say I came to housing from a couple of two different main places. So I would say in the environmental world, before my current work in energy efficiency and energy, I was doing environmental and sustainability education for a nonprofit organization. And was that focused on climate and kind of adaptation to a warming planet really kind of brought me to realize that housing and building localized communities that really provided a lot of the things that we need in our life in a closer knit way where we can bike and walk everywhere was critical to having our communities be resilient. There was also the other direction was really like a social and racial justice perspective. So um, I my mom is a Mexican immigrant. My grandparents were migrant workers, braceros, what they used to call people that would come here on seasonal work to pick different crops. And my mom's a single mom of four. She uh, married twice, both kind of didn't work out, right? For without, going into details, didn't work out. And I think she had the option of working and raising four kids only because she could afford to move out. So I think thinking about the importance of how much there is to have options on where you move is really critical. And I see that as like a gender equity issue, right? It is just like it's related to justice. There's also, having learned in the last 5 to 10 years more about just systemic racism in general, and in particular redlining and housing racism. I really see how the people that are able to make their voices heard the most, which tend to be um, uh, privileged in some way. Maybe they're privileged because they're white, or maybe they're privileged because they're male, or both, or because they're landowners, because they were lucky and fortunate enough because of the system that we've created to be able to purchase a home, that they're the ones dictating the policy. And I think the policy that has gotten us to the place where we are when it comes to housing, and really understanding all that, I maybe about 5 years ago, I kind of started getting more active and attending more, just more educated more than anything. When the opportunity came up to be part of a housing organization in Culver City early on, I it was exactly the kind of thing I had been hoping to be involved in. I was already involved in other neighborhood and community things. I had been on the finance advisory committee at the city of Culver City. I had, been president of a mom's club. I had been involved with the neighborhood association. But something like housing and really advocating for something that, in my mind, if you centered the most disadvantaged, those that are most in need, could really create a social good that was so enriching. And so that was the reason that brought me to housing, and kind of the big thing, and why I don't mind, just doing all the things we do and advocating for it. So put it back to Leonora.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Nancy. We're so excited to have you. And you've been doing an amazing job, uh, in building the movement in Culver City. And when I mean have you, I mean have you advocating in this space alongside us. So yeah, I'm really glad that you got involved, and thank you for sharing your experience. And let me take this off spotlight. Um, Actually, I'm not even sure how to do this. Sorry, I'm not like the best at Zoom here. I'm gonna spotlight me. Okay, there we go. Okay, I think that fixed it. Yeah, so now we can have more of a conversation. Yeah, no, the other thing I was going to say, Chelsea, is, I'm sorry that you experienced that at the Southern California Association of Governments from a council member. But I will say my views did not change actually when I became a mom. So I feel like not only is it patronizing and
Mhm.
sexist to say that, but it's also just false. I mean, the yes, it is hard to transport children sometimes, but I think the work that we do is so important for children and um, children's safety and future. Um, I think cars are still the number one leading cause of death for children, and so I think about that every day as a mom. And so I think what we do to promote inclusive, walkable communities is that's that fits with the values that I have as a mom, I feel. And so I just think it's completely misguided and false what that council member said to you. Um, Chelsea, I'd also love it if you could share a story about your experience with Donald Trump. Actually, I love that story, and I love it if you could share that.
Yeah, when I disrupted him in Vegas, is that the Vegas story? Yeah. So what Leonore is referring to is my history as a much more direct action activist. I love to sort of use my ability to gain access into spaces as a woman, and use it to our benefit as people who fight for better things in the world. So I had an opportunity to, in the early days of Donald Trump's campaign, go to a rally of his in Las Vegas. And when I say opportunity, I mean I rented a car and drove to Vegas so I could go to a rally and do what I did. I gained access to the event and went inside and watched the rally unfold. And after 40 minutes of that man speaking at a really opportune time in his speech, I stood up on the front barricade right in his face and unfurled a banner that said "Stop the Hate." This was in January of 2015, much time before we thought he would actually be the candidate that would become the president of the United States of America. And he did. But I was kicked out like a rock star from the casino that he was speaking in and dragged out, and have this really epic video of him saying, "Just leave her jacket, forget about her. She's just a young woman who doesn't know." And that line will live with me forever. I love that Donald Trump called me a young woman who just doesn't know anything.
Yeah, it
um,
is a badge of honor for sure.
definitely. Yeah, thank you. And I just to go back to something you said, and I appreciate you sharing that experience, because I wish I had had the clarity of mind when the council member was addressing me on that panel to say in that moment, what you're saying kind of erases the experience of plenty of women who navigate this city, in fact, without a car, and would be much better off if you would think about their experience or consider that before you asserted that I would do something different. I mean, besides the fact that he told me that I would become a mom someday for sure, like that's guaranteed of all women, personally insulting. It was just so much more deeply insulting to the experiences that all women, and especially women who are deeper in poverty, who don't have access to communities of support, that was just what was so the lasting impression on me, that was so deeply insulting. And that this man was elected to represent a community, certainly not this community of people who he was, in fact, erasing in that moment. But it really proved to me and asserted this idea of feminist world building. And this author, Leslie Kearns, she writes a book called Feminist City that I would highly recommend everyone to read. But really fabulous way of thinking about the fact that our cities, were designed for productivity, right? The capitalist model, we can get so much done if all of our resources are smashed together and we're sharing them. But I actually love to think about that as a much more feminist model of resource sharing, of community sharing, of creating common spaces for us all to be able to use and access together. But the problem with that is that we've designed these cities as if we're all white, cis, hetero men navigating them. So I believe that these spaces that are really, really poised to be perfect for the many, many hats and duties that so often women end up wearing in the world, the multiple roles of work, of whether mom, of having a job, of caretaker for family, caring for ourselves, all these things. cities are really well designed to serve women and those many jobs that they play. But we have to have leaders who see that as an opportunity. And it just made me reflect back on one of my earlier experiences at campus, where I went to school in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is a dark skies community. It was meant to protect the sky's ability to be seen at night for the planetarium that was near the campus, which is really cool. Great place. We found Pluto in Flagstaff. But as a young woman navigating campus, it was very, very scary how much darkness there was and how much absence of sight you had. And it was obvious how much danger that presented. So we Feminist Club on campus walked through the campus community, and we, asked for lights. We would, do sorts of demonstrations to fight for lighting on campus. And men on the university kept saying that it's impossible, that we can't do this. We have to work in concert with the planetarium. And women said, aren't there just different colors of light that won't mess with the skies? Like, can't we live in both worlds? So it was just this one, that we can, there's a middle way, there's an alternative way. And when I think about that idea of challenging patriarchy as we organize, it's not my experience as a woman that's the barrier to me. It's that my experience as a woman is being erased by patriarchy. That's the barrier. So how do we challenge that? So I can just live.
Yeah, I'd like to add something that Chelsea, to that. I think that reminds me a lot of some of the criticism of the kind of YIMBY movement, right? There's very much a parallel in what you're describing, and that kind of mentality of if we do X, Y, and Z, whatever that may be, it's going to be resolved. And one of the things that I really try to think about when we kind of talk about our platform or what we're trying to achieve, and I'd love to I did prepare a couple of slides, and I'd love to go over that, just for like 3 or so minutes, is really taking some lessons from anti-racism education, and who are you centering when you're taking actions. And I want to center those that need it most, right? And if we kind of focus on that, and in your case, in your on campus, women didn't feel safe. They weren't centering the safety of female students. They were centering something completely different. And I think that becomes a problem in so many of the decisions that we make at a policy level that impact housing, right? We don't focus on how do we center affordable housing and what is needed for that, right? How do we center families? I hear a lot of discussion of like, oh, we can just build tons of micro units and there we go. Well, micro units can't house a family. And I've heard that a lot in a lot of housing conversations. Oh, we'll just, everyone will just live in whatever, 150 square feet. Well, that's not the reality for a family. So I'll just say it's just that lack of ability to see bigger and see these parallel worlds and how they interact. And I agree, there needs to be a lot more women in these discussions, really, in politics overall, right? And one of the attendees said, we don't see a lot of women of color. You actually don't see a lot of women in leadership positions at all, in my mind. Not just, women of color. It's just like there's just this lacking representation. And I think there's a lot of like talking heads where who's going to outsmart whom and who's going to make someone else feel silly. And I get that that's sometimes amusing and fun and all that, but is that going to get us to what we need to do?
Nancy, thank you so much for these points. I think you're spot on about a lot of these, and I appreciate you thinking through them, especially in your role with Culver City for More Homes. Love to see your slides that you mentioned, if you want to bring those up. I can spotlight you again on here if you want.
Okay.
Let me know if you have trouble sharing your screen.
I don't think I should. Give me just one sec. Okay. Do you see a PDF?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll quickly go through these. It's just something for background for attendees that may not know. So Coverage for More Homes, our platform is being a grassroots group of residents and stakeholders in Culver City. And we're really devoted to making homes more plentiful. So that means removing barriers to it, more affordable, more equitable, protecting renters. We're very fortunate in Culver City that recently there was rent control and renters protections passed. So, and really reinforcing them and finding ways of bolstering them further. And then really unwinding our town's historic legacy of redlining and restrictive zoning. Culver City has, like many cities in the area, and really in the nation, has a history of redlining and it was a sundown town, and it has restrictive covenants in some people's deeds, still have them. So it's trying to address all of these things. And how do we further that? So I kind of want to really quickly run through our progress. So one of the big things that we've been able to do, and that to me is really critical, is really start forming coalitions. So POC for Change, or People of Color for Change, is a youth group in Culver City. It has people from the high school and college age youth from the city and nearby, and their perspective, they actually run the Instagram account for us. Just hearing them, because I think it is so critical for children and young adults to really listen to this conversation, because the options that a lot of us had to, go out on our own at whatever age and get our own apartment, or even get an apartment with like one roommate, those choices are disappearing. Bike Culver City is another organization that focuses on kind of pedestrian and bike friendly streets. We've been able to support them, and they've been able to support us in some of the advocacy we're doing. Obviously, Abundant Housing LA, Leonora and Rod, formerly Rod from Abundant Housing LA, have been super instrumental in just giving us both sometimes the language and sometimes the matter of like just act as a sounding board. Communications have been critical, and this is something we have an amazing organizer, Patrick Megan, who did our website, has done several videos that you can see online on our YouTube channel. We have another volunteer, Elias Plate Bormio, that does our email communications and social media, right? So we're also on Facebook, and Disa Lindgren, who's on today, does our Facebook posting. So communications have allowed us to go from maybe a loose group of about 20 people in November of 2020 to over 160 people today. And it's not that long, it's about 4 or 5 months. We also kind of are jumping on 2 critical opportunities to really take action and advocate and make big change. That's the general plan update. That is a process that Culver City happens to be undertaking right now in 2020, 21, and 22. In that opportunity, I am part of the Housing Technical Advisory Committee, which has been really kind of useful connection to influencing, as are other very progressive pro-housing community members. And then obviously the housing element update. So what I want to say about the housing element update, and just because Leonora asked about how our meeting went Monday, we were one of the cities that are trying to adopt the model housing element resolution. And it looks like we had an amazing turnout. We had between written and spoken comments in favor of adopting the model resolution, we had about 48 unique people that spoke in support of it. And the stories were really broad ranging, you know, from people talking about the housing job imbalance to people talking about racial justice or environmental justice, or people talking about families, or people saying, I grew up here, I bought my home for this much, and I want my kids to be able to do the same here one day. So that's been really amazing seeing that progress. You know, along with coalitions and collaborations, it's really collaborating with all levels of influencers, you know, policies, advocates, and electeds. And you know, we are very fortunate. We have people like Alex Fish, who is very pro-housing and very involved in the housing conversation. We also have Kelly Kent, Dr. Kelly Kent, who is on the board of Culver City Unified School District, who's also very involved in housing and interested in bringing affordable housing perhaps to some of the district campuses. Working with nonprofits, inviting affordable housing developers to the conversation. We have a couple of people that have engaged with us, because even if we remove all the barriers and we address land use, there is still going to be the huge hurdle of how do we provide the funding so affordable housing creation is possible in our city. And that's something we're still kind of trying to move the pieces around to see how we can figure that out. Working with parents, working with schools, and really engaging all elements of the community. And you know, housing justice is all of these things. It's gender equity, as someone mentioned. You know, when you don't have any choices of leaving the home, and if the home is not serving you and it's not a healthy home, you are less likely to stay in an unhealthy environment. And I think as our housing options are reduced, or you are more likely to end up, you know, homeless. And I think we're in the middle of a crisis when it comes to homelessness. And there's, you know, many more people that know much more about that than I, but I know housing has to be a critical piece of that solution. And then, you know, really recognizing that I'm standing, and the organization Culver City for More Homes is standing on the shoulders of giants, people that have been fighting for renters protections for years, about 4 years. You know, people that are fighting for public safety reform, people that are fighting for environmental social justice, people that have been fighting for racial justice, and really recognizing that this is not a movement. It's not, we don't stand doing pro-housing advocacy alone. And understanding how this all is all related. And then I'll last say, one of the great things that I like to think about what women bring to this conversation is, I think it's the ability of centering these other pieces, you know, climate disadvantage, people, families, affordability. And really, I don't necessarily see that being centered in the same way by some of the really loud pro-housing advocates that also happen to be male. Yeah. So, and I think with that's all I had, Leonora. So hopefully that kind of gave you a little background of Culver City for More Homes.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's put the spotlights back on. Where I went. Okay, there we go. Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was a really helpful presentation. I loved seeing the specifics about Culver City for More Homes, and congratulations for the success on Monday. It's really great. I'm so excited that Culver City might become a place of the first model housing element. You know, it's like you mentioned that Culver City was a sundown town, so I think it's kind of coming full circle, because Culver City was a model of being a sundown town. Like, there was a model town, I think, referring to their racist practices, but you know, now it can hopefully be a model on housing and equity and inclusion. So yeah, I think that's really exciting that we potentially have a model housing element city here in LA County. All thanks to the advocacy of Culver City for More Homes. So I think so it's almost 7:15, so I just want to make sure we leave 15 minutes for a Q&A. I want to get us started with a question to both panelists, which is, what do you think advocates can do to ensure that we are not centering primarily the voices of white privileged males in this space, which Nancy referred to a little bit, but maybe we can dive into this more. What can we do to make sure that we're not centering that?
Yeah, I love the principle that Nancy kept repeating, thinking about center the voices of the most impacted. And oftentimes that is not just women broadly, it's a specific woman. I think immediately sort of the opposite about when white women's voices have been centered in this, and just want to take a minute because I haven't talked about the negative side of some of the things that I've seen about women in the housing space. And I want to make sure I say this, but I think centering the voices of the most impacted is a complicated thing when it comes to women also, because especially as we have a really complex crisis unfolding around the unhoused community, and our communities, what safety means is really on the line. We have to think back to that history of racialization, the racial history we have around housing, and how gender plays a role in enforcing racial stereotypes and criminalization. And I think specifically around how white women were able to be property owners well back in the mid 1800s, but people of color weren't able to become property owners for a very long time. And therefore, our law enforcement mechanism was really set up for the protection of white people's property, and that includes white women. And to this very day, I get fearful and chills sitting in city council or neighborhood council meetings when I see white women use the fear and protection of their bodies as a means to enforce more law enforcement and criminalization about the unhoused community. And it's a really, really complex thing. And I know as women, we champion safety. We want our communities to be safe. But I think I've seen how that can go too far and start to encroach on the really dangerous racial history around white women calling for more law enforcement for Black bodies or for people of color generally. And I think it's just something I need to say and reckon with, and especially as women, I think it's a complicated history that we have to embrace. And I've really named and have been fearful of if we don't constantly center the voices of the most impacted, which again is the antidote to making sure that cis hetero white men don't just dominate the conversation, that we stop short at just centering voices like mine. And if that persists, then that also creates problems. And so I have to say that because I've seen it unfold in really dangerous ways. And as you know, situations like this morning unfold at Echo Park Lake, and we have people pushing for the forced removal of unhoused community members for the upkeep of a park, and people are saying things like, well, I haven't felt safe going to that park in months as the reason. I contend with what all that means and what that'll mean for the allocation and distribution of resources to address it. So just want to say that, and sorry it took so much to say that.
I think that's those are very important points, and I would. The other response to that is you have to seek out those community members and
Right.
listen, and I think that's something, and it's not going to be quick. You're not going to get those, the voices of the most impacted are not necessarily going to come to you because they're busy working, two jobs, 3 jobs, and taking care of children, and maybe being single heads of single parent households. So I think it's really getting out there, which is the pandemic has kind of been a curse and a blessing, I'll be honest, because in a way it's a blessing because I have never called people faster when I get someone's phone number and I just call them. And I'm like, hi, name's Nancy Barba, So that part is great. And then the part that's not great is that there's not a whole lot of FaceTime opportunity. So you can't meet people just out in the community. But you have to seek them out. I will say, like, very specifically. And I'm not saying you're going to seek them out and just kind of try to convert them to the thing. You're going to seek them out and listen to their concerns around land use, about housing, about rent, about whatever that is, and validating what it is they want to bring to the conversation.
Thanks so much for these really important points. I think, this is really important for cities and jurisdictions too, and other, even councils of governments. They do a lot of community input, community outreach. What does that really mean unless they're going out to all communities and getting a true representation, and more than that, even elevating the input of people who are most affected by the decisions getting made. So I see so many examples, especially in this housing element update cycle, of cities doing community input, but really, like, who's serving in those input places, like who's there, and it's always privileged white homeowners, almost exclusively. And I see this also. I sit on the housing commission in Santa Monica, and we have that problem as well on the commission. And you know that's because, frankly, we get appointed to the commission, and so the people who maybe don't have the time to be involved with local politics, or do a lot of networking in Santa Monica, they don't have a chance to serve on the housing commission. And so we're currently looking into better ways to systematically diversify the commission, so we can ensure diversity on the commission long term. I'm really excited by some of those ideas, but that's how input has been on housing in the city. It's like, where are the people most affected, who are facing homelessness, who are facing displacement. They should be the first people asked to weigh in on these decisions, because they're who's going to be affected. Um, so I just think that's a really good point. And yeah, and please submit questions. We don't have any questions pending right now. We only have 10 minutes left, but if anybody in the audience wants to submit some questions, some topics for discussion, um, I will. Oh, did you have a question,
Yeah,
Chelsea?
yeah. No, I was just going to jump in and also say that, today's the day that we recognize the gender pay gap. So it's like wage equity or pay equity day for white women specifically, which means that, for folks who don't know, that today is the day that women have made the same amount of money that men made last year. Women finally caught up today on average. And that's just white women. So for Black women, I think it's like August that it's the catch up, and then Latina women and Asian women, it's like September. It's bad. But it's a symbolic day just to recognize that while the average median weekly earnings for women in 2020 were 82.3% of what men earned, Latinas again 58.7%. Black women 63.6. It's bad. And I think that disparity that exists, the other way that we confront that, as Nancy had mentioned earlier, is affordable housing. It's the case for more affordable housing and appropriate sales of affordable housing. So just think about, I think about the way that women's issues, and I work with women's organizations and work to support getting more women elected, that the housing conversation, even homelessness, has been sort of slow to move into women's issues. It's domestic violence, and so we think about shelters, but we're not really thinking about what it means to be a part of this gender pay gap and what we're losing out on. And I also think about generational wealth. Women aren't purchasing property if they're not earning this type of money. It's big things. So yeah, I could imagine an intersectional housing movement lifting up and celebrating gender pay gap days as ways to celebrate ways that women are continuously, or recognize women are continuously held back, right? And I'd just love to see that more of that type of intersection between women's organizations and the housing organizations, because it's how we can build stronger movements together.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. We have a question in the chat from Charles Taylor. Thanks for joining, Charles, by the way. And has anybody reached out to council member's office about the Echo Park situation? From
I've only heard about it secondhand over social media and reading the stories and news today from people who are there.
Same.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah, I think that's a terrible situation, a huge concern. Actually, I went to Echo Park recently, and I was impressed at how much of a community had been created there, like a positive functioning community. And I think that said a lot about the unhoused people forced to make the best of a situation like that in Echo Park. And to sweep that, I think is a terrible injustice. And it's really it's like the surrounding city that is so hostile. Not people who have set up a supportive, like, cooperative community in Echo Park. It's really the surrounding society that's aggressive, dangerous, and hostile. So anyway, that was just something that I noticed about visiting. But I appreciate everyone bringing this up, because this is sort of a rapidly unfolding situation. And yeah, we should be involved with this as much as possible.
There's a question from Sochi, Leonora.
Thank you. Yes, I had the Q&A panel closed. Okay. Yeah. Sochi, thank you. What do you recommend for those entering the professional field of housing to take with themselves back to their current roles? What other groups can we join to stay connected with other women in the field? The panelists have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. Sochi, hey, really glad to have you here. I first think it's really important that wherever women already exist, we need to be having conversations around housing. Again, it took me a while to think about it, even though I had a lot of personal experience with it. And then once it, sort of became a clear thing in my mind, it's like the thing that I'm going to fight for the rest of my life. I think it's really important to think about contextualizing housing issues for other women, and not just finding the housing spaces and then bringing women to them also. So that's one thing I'd say. And then the other part about entering the profession, thank you for being a part of this work in a professional way and dedicating your life to it in that way. Make more space for women. I mean, I think I'm having spent time in a professionalized workspace around this issue, what I noticed was actually that a lot more women were involved. I was on more of the homeless services side of the space, and a lot of women tend to be involved there, but not on the more technical side. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can start to have conversations with people about the technical side that sort of break it down, make it less intimidating, and ultimately having conversations with male peers about the ways that it's intimidating, that mansplaining attitude. I mean, just the things that like turn women off to the idea that they could be a part of that space. It's that's really great conversations to be having. And I think if you're a part of an organization that doesn't have external facing events, it's a really cool thing to do to center the voices of you all in the community more. And I think in that way, it enriches our communities and makes them better. So thank you for what you're doing. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking on what Chelsea said, a couple of expressions that, I'm sure these are commonly known, but that I always think about is like the expression sending the elevator back down, and learn one, teach one. If you get a promotion, if you get an opportunity, always make sure that you bring along women and women of color. I think that's really important. I try to do that a lot in my professional sphere, and I think it's important we do it in our community activism and advocacy sphere.
Awesome.
Thanks so much. I see Terry also submitted a question. Also, great to see you virtually, Terry. Thank you for joining. Terry asks, movements such as Black Lives Matter have been more impactful when they include white people. How can women leverage a similar inclusion of men?
Yeah, we need men to help us challenge patriarchy also, and it doesn't serve anyone. Right? It does not serve anyone. We're all better off if we challenge patriarchy. And I think ultimately, like, again, centering voices, sort of being men listen to men before they listen to women. It really seems to be the case. So if you are observant and an ally to these things, always having conversations with men is a good thing. Recognizing and noticing when women are absent on panels, I was just looking at statistics about how many conferences, like urban planning conferences, have just men as speakers on panels consistently. And like, you know, it's always good to just look around and be like, couldn't there be somebody else here? Is this conversation missing somebody? Or when it is, you know, just making note of that. It's really important.
Thank you. Yes, I agree that we really do need to have male allies as much as possible. Men definitely have a role to play in, you know, in feminism, in the housing movement. Nancy, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think there's definitely a role for everyone, and privilege should be spent, right? Like I always encourage people. I have plenty of privilege. You got to spend it. You know, that's what it's there for. If you happen to have access, or someone will listen to you because of your position, you have to use that to support others and support the wider need.
Yes, I like that phrase, that privilege should be spent. That's a really it's an inspirational quote. Thank you.
I want a book of Nancy quotes after this hour. Like, this has been really epic.
This is me butchering like quotes, so
I'll take
That's
it.
Great. Yes. Okay, great. Well, we're at 7:30, so we're at time. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists for this great conversation. And I feel a lot more hopeful about my own role in this space. You know, just having this session, we should do this more regularly, I think. And yeah, appreciate you all. Thank you so much to the audience for attending. And good night, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
thank you, everyone.